Imagine a room filled with students, their eyes fixed on clay tablets instead of smartphones. They're scratching cuneiform symbols into soft clay with reed styluses, practicing their writing under the stern gaze of their instructor. The year is 2000 BC. The location? Ancient Mesopotamia. And these students? They're attending the world's very first school. But here's what makes this discovery truly remarkable. We know exactly what they studied, how they were punished, and even what they complained about after class. Because unlike the countless civilizations that vanished without a trace, these ancient students left behind something extraordinary: their homework. And when archaeologists finally deciphered it, they discovered that education 4,000 years ago was shockingly similar to what we experience today. The question is, why did humanity's first schools emerge in this particular place, at this specific moment in history? And what happened when learning was no longer passed down from parent to child, but became an institution that would forever change the course of human civilization? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why the world's first schools appeared in ancient Mesopotamia, we need to step back to a pivotal moment in human history. Around 3500 BC, something unprecedented was happening in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Cities were rising from the desert plains, not small villages, but massive urban centers with populations reaching into the tens of thousands. Uruk, one of the largest, sprawled across nearly 6 square kilometers and housed somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people. This wasn't just growth. It was an explosion of human organization unlike anything the world had ever seen. But with this growth came an unforeseen problem. As these city-states expanded, they became almost impossibly complex to manage. Temples needed to track offerings from thousands of worshippers. Merchants needed to record transactions across vast trade networks stretching from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia. Kings needed to document tax collections, military campaigns, and the redistribution of grain to workers. The human mind, no matter how sharp, simply couldn't remember it all. Memory alone wasn't enough anymore. So the Mesopotamians invented something revolutionary: writing. The earliest forms were simple: pictographs pressed into wet clay. A circle with lines might represent a sheep. A triangular shape could indicate grain. But within a few centuries, this system evolved into something far more sophisticated. Those simple pictures transformed into cuneiform, a complex script with hundreds of wedge-shaped symbols that could represent not just objects, but sounds, ideas, and abstract concepts. Suddenly, humanity could preserve knowledge outside the fragile confines of human memory. But here's the problem they didn't anticipate. Writing changed everything. Once knowledge could be preserved in clay, someone needed to know how to read and write it. And that wasn't a skill you could pick up in an afternoon. Cuneiform wasn't like learning an alphabet with 26 letters. It required mastering between 600 and 1,000 different symbols, each with multiple possible meanings depending on context. It demanded years of practice, endless repetition, and expert instruction. The informal education that had sustained humanity for millennia, a father teaching his son to hunt, a mother teaching her daughter to weave, simply couldn't produce the literate administrators that these growing cities desperately needed. So around 2000 BC, the Sumerians created something entirely new: the edubba, which translates directly as tablet house. This was the world's first formal school, and we know about these institutions in extraordinary detail because of an archaeological discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about ancient education. In the ruins of cities like Nippur and Ur, archaeologists unearthed thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, and many of them were school exercises, practice tablets where students had painstakingly copied texts over and over again. But more fascinating than the practice tablets were the literary texts the students copied, because among them were something entirely unexpected: essays about school life itself. One of the most remarkable is a Sumerian composition scholars call School Days. It's written from the perspective of a student, and it reads like a complaint that could have been written yesterday. The student describes waking up early, asking his mother for his lunch, and rushing to school, terrified of being late. When he arrives, he recites his lesson to the Ummiyah, the teacher, and then writes out his assignment on a clay tablet. But things don't go well. He's beaten for talking. He's beaten for standing up without permission. He's beaten for poor handwriting. In fact, the essay lists 7 different canings in a single school day. This wasn't metaphorical. It was apparently standard practice. The ancient Mesopotamians believed that education and discipline were inseparable. But the essay doesn't end with punishment. In a twist that reveals just how human these ancient people were, the student goes home and tells his father about his troubles. The father, wanting to ensure his son's academic success, invites the teacher home for dinner. He seats him in the place of honor, serves him food and drink, clothes him in a new garment, gives him a gift, and even places a ring on his finger. And what happens next? The teacher's attitude completely changes. He praises the student's writing, declares that he will excel among his peers, and predicts a bright future for him. The implication is clear. Even in the world's first schools, parents were trying to get their children ahead by currying favor with teachers. But who were these students? That's where the story becomes more complicated and reveals something profound about ancient society. Education in the edubba wasn't free, and it wasn't for everyone. Families had to pay tuition, provide tablets and writing tools, and perhaps most significantly, they had to sacrifice the labor their children might otherwise contribute to the household. This meant that formal schooling was almost exclusively reserved for the sons of the elite, the children of scribes, priests, government administrators, and wealthy merchants. Girls were generally excluded, not because Mesopotamians believed women were incapable of learning, but because the career paths open to literate individuals, scribe, accountant, temple administrator, government official, were closed to women. The curriculum itself was rigorous and remarkably standardized across different cities. Students began by learning the most basic cuneiform signs, practicing them over and over on clay tablets until their hands knew the movements by memory. They progressed to copying word lists, hundreds upon hundreds of Sumerian words organized by category, lists of trees, lists of animals, lists of professions, lists of gods. These weren't just vocabulary exercises, they were comprehensive attempts to categorize all human knowledge. After mastering word lists, students moved on to copying proverbs, practicing mathematical problems, and eventually studying the great literary works of Mesopotamian culture, including the Epic of Gilgamesh and hymns to the gods. The school day was long and exhausting. Students typically arrived at dawn and remained until the afternoon, 6 days a week. The schoolhouse itself was often just a room in the teacher's home, with students sitting on the floor or on brick benches, tablets in their laps. The atmosphere was strict. The headmaster, called the Ummiyah or expert, commanded absolute respect. Beneath him were specialized instructors, the scribe of Sumerian, who taught language, the scribe of mathematics, who taught calculation, and the big brother, an advanced student who supervised younger pupils and sometimes served as an enforcer of discipline. But here's what's truly fascinating. Despite the harsh discipline and demanding curriculum, these schools worked. They produced generation after generation of literate, numerate administrators who kept Mesopotamian civilization functioning for over 2,000 years. The graduates of these edubbas went on to manage temple economies, conduct diplomatic correspondence with foreign powers, record legal decisions, compile astronomical observations, and preserve the literary and religious traditions that defined their culture. Without them, the complexity that made Mesopotamian civilization possible would have collapsed. Yet even as these schools succeeded in their primary mission, something unexpected was happening. Education was creating a new social class. Before formal schooling, status was largely hereditary. You were a farmer because your father was a farmer. You were a priest because you were born into a priestly family. But literacy changed the equation. A talented student from a moderately wealthy family could potentially rise higher than his birth would have otherwise allowed. The edubba became a pathway, limited and narrow, but real, for social advancement. The scribal class developed its own identity, its own professional pride, and even its own literature celebrating the superiority of the educated mind over physical labor. One Sumerian text, The Scribe and His Perverse Son, captures this tension beautifully. A father who has worked hard to provide his son with an education berates him for laziness and ingratitude. He contrasts his son's easy life with the hard labor of other professions, the merchant who must travel dangerous roads, the farmer who toils under the burning sun, the metalworker who breathes toxic fumes. He tells his son that he's been given an extraordinary opportunity, a chance to live by his mind rather than his muscles, and that squandering it is the height of foolishness. It's a sentiment that echoes across millennia, the immigrant parent reminding their child of sacrifices made, the working-class father insisting his daughter stay in college, the universal parental plea for children to recognize and seize educational opportunity. But approximately halfway through the second millennium BC, something began to change. The Sumerian language itself was dying. Not the culture, not the civilization, but the spoken language. New powers were rising in Mesopotamia, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and they spoke Semitic languages rather than Sumerian. Yet remarkably, the schools didn't disappear. Instead, they adapted. Sumerian became what Latin would later become in medieval Europe, a classical language of scholarship, religion, and administration. Students now had to master not one but two languages, Sumerian as a scholarly tongue and Akkadian as their vernacular. The curriculum expanded to include bilingual dictionaries and translation exercises. Education became even more demanding, even more specialized, and even more essential for anyone seeking an administrative career. The edubbas also began teaching something that hadn't been part of the original curriculum: critical thinking. Advanced students studied legal cases and learned to construct arguments. They analyzed mathematical problems that had multiple solution methods. They debated theological questions. Education was no longer just about memorizing information. It was about learning to think systematically, to analyze complex problems, and to articulate solutions. The schools were producing not just scribes, but intellectuals. Archaeological evidence reveals just how widespread these schools became. Excavations across Mesopotamia have uncovered school tablets in cities from Susa in the east to Mari in the west. Each site shows the same standardized curriculum, the same progression of learning, the same texts being copied generation after generation. This suggests something remarkable. The Mesopotamians had developed not just individual schools, but an educational system. Teachers in different cities were teaching the same material in the same order, which implies coordination, shared standards, and probably teacher training. In other words, they had invented formal education as an institution, not just as an activity. But who were the teachers themselves? This is where our evidence becomes tantalizingly fragmentary. We know they were called umia, and that the position commanded respect and apparently decent compensation. We know that some teachers specialized in particular subjects, while others provided general instruction. We know they could be strict to the point of brutality, yet also capable of genuine affection for their students. Several texts mention teachers praising talented pupils or expressing disappointment in those who failed to meet their potential. But their individual stories, their motivations for teaching, their personal struggles and triumphs, these are lost to time. They left behind thousands of student exercises, but few personal records of their own. What we do know is that the system they created outlasted empires. The edubbas continued functioning through the rise and fall of dynasties, through conquest and occupation, through periods of prosperity and devastating warfare. Even when foreign powers conquered Mesopotamian cities, they often adopted the existing educational system because they needed literate administrators just as desperately as the previous rulers had. Education, it turned out, was more durable than political power. The influence of these first schools rippled outward across the ancient world. When Egyptian civilization developed formal schooling, it bore striking similarities to the Mesopotamian model. Strict discipline, rote memorization, copying of classic texts, and education reserved for the elite. The same pattern appeared in ancient China, in India, and eventually in Greece and Rome. The specific content differed, but the fundamental structure, dedicated teachers, standardized curriculum, years of study, and education as preparation for administrative or religious roles, remained remarkably consistent. It's as if humanity, having invented formal schooling once, recognized its utility and replicated the model across cultures. The edubba system continued in various forms until the very end of cuneiform culture itself. The last known cuneiform text dates to 75 AD, scrawled by a scribe in Babylon. For over 3,000 years, students had been learning to write in wedge-shaped symbols on clay tablets, had been copying the same ancient word lists, had been studying in rooms supervised by strict teachers who believed discipline and learning were inseparable. And then it ended. The knowledge of cuneiform faded. The tablets were buried under centuries of sand and soil. The world's first schools were forgotten. But they weren't gone forever. When archaeologists began excavating Mesopotamian sites in the 19th and 20th centuries, those school tablets emerged again. And in deciphering them, scholars made a startling discovery. These ancient students weren't alien to us. Their complaints about waking up early, their fear of punishment, their pride in good work and shame at poor performance, their teachers' frustration with lazy pupils and delight in talented ones, all of it felt immediately, profoundly familiar. The specifics had changed. Clay tablets replaced by paper, replaced by computers, cuneiform replaced by alphabets, replaced by keyboards, but the essential experience of formal education remained recognizable across 4,000 years. So why does this matter? Why should we care about schools that closed before the Roman Empire even existed? Because the edubba represents something fundamental about human civilization. It's the moment we decided that knowledge was too important to leave to chance, that the future was too important to trust entirely to informal, haphazard learning. The Mesopotamians looked at their increasingly complex world and made a revolutionary choice. They would deliberately, systematically, prepare the next generation to inherit and manage that complexity. They would create institutions whose sole purpose was learning. That decision reverberates through every classroom in existence today. The frustrations of modern education, the standardized testing, the rigid curricula, the inequality of access, the tension between practical skills and broader learning, were present from the very beginning. But so were the possibilities, that education could be a pathway to opportunity, that knowledge could be preserved and expanded across generations, that human beings could deliberately shape minds and thereby shape the future. The world's first schools weren't perfect, but they worked well enough that we're still, 4 millennia later, gathering young people in rooms and asking them to learn. The methods have evolved. The technology has transformed beyond recognition. But the fundamental faith that education matters, that learning can be taught, that investing in the minds of the young pays dividends for society as a whole, that faith was born in Mesopotamia, in small rooms filled with students hunched over clay tablets, trying to form perfect cuneiform wedges under the watchful eyes of the world's first teachers. And perhaps the most remarkable thing of all is this. Somewhere in ancient Nippur, a student once pressed a complaint into soft clay about how unfair his teacher was, how harsh the discipline, how difficult the work. He couldn't have imagined that 4,000 years later, we'd be reading his words and recognizing ourselves in his frustration. Education, it seems, is one of the most enduring and most essentially human things we've ever created.